Yeah, I can see how that could be worse. Yeah, no. Oh no. Oh boy. Yeah.
Well, he's got some. He got a
Oh, I
second.
saw, I saw. The thing with the Warriors was his iPhone.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
he had 3 different days.
Check 1 2. Check. Testing 1 2.
No, he's
Check 1 2. Test.
pretty good. He's been around a while.
Checking 1 2. Test.
He's bailed me out of more than
Check 1 2.
my share of problems.
Okay, this is going to be your microphone.
Okay, good, good, good.
This is going to be your pointer.
It's gonna be my pointer. What do I do to point?
Just press that top right button. And to forward through your slides,
Yeah. What do I do to forward through my slides?
here, I'll show you.
Yeah.
You're just going to press this forward arrow right there. So, like if you tap it one time, it's going to go to the next slide.
Okay.
If you want to tap it back and go back,
Okay.
just like that.
Oh, that's easier than usual. Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Now, we are webcast? Okay.
All right, now are we turning this one off while I'm talking so they don't fight with each other?
Now, when we open up for questions.
Oh, they can talk.
No, no, no.
Yeah.
Because we're being webcast.
We're gonna not have questions
No, no,
during the thing.
no, no, no. I think there's going to be another handheld mic that I'm just going to say after you finish. I'm going to tell people to wait for the mic so that it can get picked up.
I have no control over that.
No, no, well, okay, well, but people can, since it's a small enough room, people can, drag over and ask a question without a mic.
No, they can't because I can't hear it.
Well,
Just want to introduce myself. I'm Mike Clark.
Oh.
It's good to meet you. Thank you for
I
being here.
wouldn't say lucky you because you're a dean.
It's going all right.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Okay.
I get to do things like get this off, which is great. So, thanks for coming up.
Thank you.
You came in
This morning, yes.
and it wasn't too bad.
Oh no, it's completely clear. Yeah, no, we just had like blizzard all day yesterday, and then we plowed through. But yes, I was lucky. I fly from here to fly out of LaGuardia. You're familiar with hazardous, affectionately known in the business like garbage, and yeah. Majority of those reflections are good days. So
So when it's snowing.
yeah, no, it was completely not working yesterday, but it was working today. Hey.
this is Matt Weston. He's a part of the group. He was going to be at lunch at Kevin DeLay say that
With the changing schedule,
I see.
but I'm glad you made it in.
Thank you.
Coming out of New York?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
My garbage, as I was just telling you.
Yeah.
We're lucky to get out of there on a clear sunny day.
Yeah,
Let
that's
alone
right.
a day after
A lot of snow.
for us,
Yeah.
6 inches is a lot of snow.
Yeah.
We don't, I mean, that's sort of part of the breakdown of everything. We don't, somewhere along the line in the last 20 years, somebody made a decision that it would be cheaper to shut things down than to deal with snow plows and de-icers and things like that. We'll just
Interesting
shut
choice.
stuff. That seems to have been the choice. I mean, it's pretty embarrassing that the state governor declares a state of emergency for 6 inches of snow.
Yeah, right.
I mean, the people would just laugh in Michigan if we did that.
Yeah, Cleveland is just Monday.
Yeah, that's just, we can guess, it's winter, we have snow, we plow it, and then we deal with it, right?
Right. Good. Well, I'm glad you were able to make it. Notwithstanding the weather.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to our law school on a nice sunny spring day. For those of you who don't know me or who don't recognize me since I shaved off the beard, I'm Michael Scharf, the co-dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law, and it is my great honor to welcome you to this year's Norman A. Sugarman Lecture. This lecture was made possible by the generosity of Mr. Sugarman, one of our most distinguished alums, and his family. A native Clevelander and a double alumnus of this university, he was a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Adelbert College and graduated at the top of his class here at the law school. He held a variety of positions at the Internal Revenue Service from 1940 to 1954, including Assistant Commissioner, the first non-political appointee in that role. Mr. Sugarman returned to Cleveland in 1954 and spent the rest of his career as as a partner at Baker Hostetler. He was baking it up good too. You might notice that we have a wonderful photograph on our wall of the partner from Baker Hostetler whose generosity made this room possible as well. So there's a double connection for today. Now, back to Mr. Sugarman. He was an extremely talented, thoughtful, and creative tax lawyer with an almost encyclopedia knowledge of the Internal Revenue Code. A frequent lecturer all over the country, he had an uncanny ability to present complex topics in understandable terms. His support of this lecture series was only part of the consistent generosity in support of the law school, for which he was recognized with the Fletcher Reed Andrews Outstanding Alumnus Award and his election to our Society of Benchers. To introduce this year's wonderful Sugarman lecturer, I present my faculty colleague, Jonathan Enton. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And I'm really delighted to be able to introduce this year's Norman A. Sugarman lecturer. Those of you who know me know that I am not a tax person, but I am still happy to be part of this. This has been a really remarkable series. Over the years, we've had such prominent tax scholars as William Andrews, Boris Bitker, Marvin Chirlstein, and Bernard Wolfman. We've had lecturers who were members of what used to be called the Tax Writing House Ways and Means Committee, such as Barbara Conable of New York and Donald Pease of Ohio, and various tax policy officials, including a couple of our alumni, Donald Korb of the class of '73, who was chief counsel of the Internal Revenue Service, and Mark Weinberger from the class of 1987, who was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Tax Policy. This year's lecturer is Lee Shepard, who is a worthy addition to this series. Lee is one of the most widely read and respected tax commentators in the world. She is a contributing editor of Tax Notes, a Washington-based weekly tax journal, and just for the record, Lee has been at Tax Notes longer than I've been on our faculty, which is saying something. She writes about a wide range of cutting-edge topics such as derivatives, hybrid securities and hedge funds, banking, and securities law. It is a particular pleasure for me to introduce Lee Shepard, despite my not being a tax person, because Lee and I were law school classmates. In fact, we sat next to each other every day of the week throughout the first year during the 9 o'clock hour through our torts and contracts classes. As a result, I got to know firsthand how sharp Lee's mind is. And I actually took the liberty of looking this up last night. Lee also wrote a terrific journal piece about a recurring and important theme in the law of criminal procedure, and with no immediate tax connection, how to make the disclosure requirements of Brady against Maryland work more effectively. Lee is a very smart and very outspoken person with lots of interesting and provocative ideas. And so it's a real pleasure for me to welcome her to talk about how the tax law reinforces economic and other policies. Lee?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's kind of fitting that I'm here talking to you today because Pete Peterson died a couple of days ago. Folks know who he is? Right? He's the one who wants to cut Social Security. Oh yes. He had this like kind of fairy tale career track where he started as a child in his dad's store working the cash register, and unfortunately he took that economic lesson about taking in what you spending no more than you take in and things like that kind of cash register thinking followed him through his life. And when he became very rich selling his share of Blackstone, which is the leveraged buyout firm, he took his ill-gotten $1 billion and he endowed the Peterson Institute. And the Peterson Institute runs around advocating cutting Social Security, capping Medicare and making it into a voucher, so if you use more than a certain amount, monetary amount of, health costs, why you're just out of luck and you should just die or find some other money. And the whole thinking of that is, well, the federal government is like a household with a budget or like dad's store with the cash register, and we can't spend more than we take in. And all of that is, first of all, it's been a campaign for about 30 years to convince people of this, just like various campaigns in the 1930s to convince people of things that were not so. It's not so. It is absolutely, positively not so. And we're going to talk about that. We do not tax for revenue. We do not tax to get money to spend. And we're going to go through the history of, the reserve currency and why we don't even have to tax to spend, why there is not a limited supply of dollars in the world, even though there was a limited supply of dollars in Dad's cash register. And, why this whole campaign over the last couple of decades is just complete nonsense. So we're going to start a little here. We're gonna, no, that's not the right thing. I gotta get my, all right. Okay, folks know what that is. Come on. Numbers on the tail. No, that's new and expensive. No, more expensive. It's the F-35. Yes. See, this is why President Trump should have that military parade, okay? Because that's about what this thing is good for, is being pushed down the street in a show-offy way. This thing cost $1.5 trillion. The federal government has ordered about 450 of them. It is supposed to engage in electronic warfare and figure things out all by itself, and maybe it can do that. We know that it can't really fly, it can't really fight, it can't really evade radar, and it doesn't carry very much payload. Because what you're looking at really is like a pile of very expensive computer equipment sort of housed inside an airplane housing there. It's been a fiasco. It's an ongoing fiasco because what they're doing, I forget what this is called, the procedure, they're purchasing it while they're still testing it and trying to put it in the air. And then pilots are coming back and saying things like, I didn't have any oxygen up there. The engine caught fire. The nose dipped when we tried to take off from an aircraft carrier and that slingshotty type thing. We could just go on and on all day. Actually, I gave this speech in Idaho. There's a testing ground in Idaho where they were testing this thing, and I had a whole bunch of people who knew this stuff, and we were like just going through it. But anyway, for our purposes, what's interesting about this is not only does it cost a ridiculous amount of money, and not only is it a kind of feeding frenzy for U.S. contractors and foreign contractors as well. There are contractors from all over the world working on this thing. It's 40% of Lockheed's revenues. Maybe you should be long Lockheed. But also the proof that we don't tax for revenue and we are not constrained in our spending by what we take in is military spending. If we were to put this thing in the air and take it to one of our many war zones, the cost of flying it, and to man bombing costs about $1 billion a week. The cost of flying it would not be on budget. Purchasing it, the hardware, is on budget. The cost of flying is not. And you say, well, how can you have a budget where some stuff's not on budget and some stuff isn't? Well, We do. It's sort of like if you know, I hate to go to the household analogy because we're not so constrained, but you know how you look at your checking book, right, and you think, well, that's what I'm spending, right? But then you find all the receipts from the Apple store that the kids hid from you, right? And all the charge account receipts from the Hollister store when they bought those clothes that you didn't recognize, right? That's what OCO is. That's the overseas continuing operations. That is, it's the war spending that's not on budget. There's other spending that we don't even know about because they call them black budgets. There are secret military budgets that are not on budget. And these are very large numbers. And so when people scream about the deficit, and because they're doing in Washington, as we speak, they're doing a spending bill. They're all trying to agree on a spending bill, and they're going to spend $1.5 trillion. And oh, heavens to Betsy, that's just such a big number. And I'm getting emails from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities and all these very serious-sounding think tanks talking about how irresponsible this is and how we won't be able to pay our debt and how we'll owe money to our grandchildren. We own most of our debt. We don't need to pay it off. But we'll have to pay interest. We're in ZIRP. The interest rate, federal funds rate, is 0.5%, and that's only because we just raised it. We hardly pay any interest. But there's all this hair on fire stuff, and they're having a hair on fire moment about the numbers that are on budget. They're not even paying attention to the numbers that would be attached to flying that thing. We're not even, and you could say, oh my goodness, the deficit is much bigger than we think it is. The deficit doesn't matter. That's the point. And we don't spend like it matters. If we, let's get back to Mr. Peterson for a second. Mr. Peterson's whole think tank has been telling people for at least 20, well, it's only existed about 20 years. Oh, we can't afford Social Security. Oh, Social Security is going bankrupt. Oh, we must cut it or raise the age or some silly thing like that, right? No one ever asks those kinds of questions about bombing. Bombing's $1 billion a week, okay? No one ever says, oh, no, we have to go diving into the sofa cushions looking for the Sunoco card to put fuel in that thing. And you say, well, how on earth can we possibly get away with that? My goodness gracious. Well, Mr. Peterson, when he died, he was, and I know you think, well, you're speaking ill of the dead. Yes, I am speaking ill of the dead. I'm allowed, okay? He was 91 when he died, but we've had the reserve currency for 100 years. For the first few years when we had it, we didn't know it. But we have had it for about 100 years now, since the end of World War I. Now, but we were lucky to begin with, because look, what do you see there, right? You see, let's see if we can get the pointer onto the map. Okay, there. What do you see? You see a large land mass with a lot of minerals and natural resources, protected by sea on either side, right? If you got that, you'd have to really work hard to screw it up. You're kind of lucky to have that, compared to, say, this. Come on, laser pointer, I want you to go where I think you're going. Compared to, boy, this thing is hard to run. Okay, well, compared to that little island right up there, that was the empire right here, these folks right here, okay, the cold little gray island. Here's what happened in World War I. And, we were lending to the folks who were fighting. World War I was sort of a collaborative effort by the Europeans. They wanted to have a war with themselves, so they found excuses. And we were lending to them, and we sort of kept that going longer than it should have. Everyone was on the gold standard at the time, and this is pertinent, okay, because the gold standard is thought to, just like the cash register, it is thought to constrain how much you spend, right? But every time people wanted to start a war, they sort of had a way of falling off the wagon, And these folks fell off the wagon. They started a war with themselves. It would have burned out sooner if we hadn't lent the money. But when it was all said and done, right, 1918, none of these people had empires anymore. And the United States dollar was the reserve currency. And then everybody tried very hard to go back on the gold standard and behave, because that was the, mark of fiscal probity. That's what you had then. Now, what's that? Looks like a jail, right? That is, guys, you guys all recognize that thing. Wow, I put that up in front of somebody, and I was like, what the hell is that? That is Fort Knox. Now, what's in there? You think there's any gold in there? I think there's like bricks with gold paint on them. Does the gold that's in there back up the United States currency? Please say no. Okay. No. What this was the United States had fallen off the wagon again, right? And this was built in the 1930s. And this was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was very clever about these things. It's really amazing. To shore up confidence in the currency by saying, look, here, we have this thing in Tennessee, and it's got gold bars in it and everything, and our currency is really sound. We were probably already on a fiat currency at the time, but we had the reserve currency and we didn't know it. And meanwhile, what was Roosevelt doing? He was establishing the Social Security system, and he was also about to prosecute a war in Europe, which nobody wanted. Americans did not want to go back and get hooked up in another European war after World War I, okay? And Roosevelt had to convince them to participate, and he, in fact, had to be convinced to participate himself. So with Social Security, they put on this tax, and they said, everybody pays in, and then they take out, well, they take out actuarially quite a bit more than they pay in, but everybody pays in and everybody participates, and then when you get older, you take some out, right? And this makes people feel like they paid for it. Do Social Security taxes pay for Social Security? No, they do not. No, taxes don't pay for anything. But notice how clever this is. This makes everyone feel like they're participating, and makes everyone, yes, I put in my money, and now I'm taking some out, right? It's just like the other thing that Roosevelt did was, when the United States entered the war, okay, it wasn't all that costly for us to enter that war, okay? But to make people feel like they were participating, they asked them to take the bumpers off their cars. Now, the bumpers on those cars were useless anyway, because they were these big chrome things that didn't really, do anything when you hit something. They just fell off anyway. Take the bumpers off the cars and take them to scrap heaps or something and turn them into the government for use in the war. Now, did the government need your car bumper for the war? No, the government did not need your car bumper for the war. And the war wasn't costing that much in terms of gross domestic product. But you see the participatory notion here. Make people feel like they're giving something up when they're taking their bumper off their car and bringing it to the place. So, around the same time, the central bankers, when they're figuring all this out, because this is when they figured out the concept of gross domestic product, they figured out, it's like, wait a minute, we have the reserve currency. We don't need to tax at all. And right around, boy, these recyclable bottles are like recycling themselves while you're drinking out of them. It's like, yes, I believe that is biodegradable, because it's biodegrading right now. This is when the income tax had been a class tax. It had actually been aimed at movie actors and people like that who were making pots of money. Right around the time of World War I, when it was instituted, it was made into a mass tax in around World War II, maybe in the 40s. And but very recently, in the second Bush administration in 2001, with those tax cuts, we made it back into a class tax, and that stuck through the Obama administration. into this tax reform bill. And it actually made it very complicated to cut people's taxes because there was a substantial number of people who were not paying a whole lot in income taxes. So it's like, well, how are we going to give them an income tax cut when they're not paying a whole lot? But let's get back down to what did these folks discover in the 30s when they woke up one day and, you know, Europe had basically self-immolated and the United States dollar instead of British sterling was the reserve currency. They noticed, well, if we don't have the tax to spend, what are we up to here? Well, one of the things we're up to, and this sounds preposterous to say this to an American audience, but we have taxes to redeem the currency. We have taxes so people will hold dollars. Now, it's inconceivable to you folks and to most business guys in America, well, how could you have somebody who wasn't holding dollars? But imagine you had somebody. What did I do with that thing? I lost it. Oh, there it is. Okay, imagine you had somebody who actually, we got to get back to the oil story too. So let's go to the oil story here. Imagine you had somebody who was, you know, see that oil over there in Siberia? You know, it's very hard to get, and they need, you know, Americans are actually quite good at those things, getting hard to get oil. What if you hired an American oil services company to get oil out of Siberia, and you said, well, you know, oh, we're selling it to the Chinese and they're paying us in Chinese currency. You could do business in rubles or, I can't pronounce the name of the Chinese currency. And you wouldn't necessarily have to hold dollars, but you would have to hold dollars to pay American taxes. You'd also have to hold dollars. You do have to hold dollars to buy and sell oil, and we'll get to that in a minute. But let's go back to the 30s. They discovered that, okay, you have to get people to hold the currency. You want to price the subsidies that you've got. So you want to put a price on, once we promised people Social Security, what is this costing us to do? Once we had the national, you know, some of those programs that Roosevelt had in the 30s to create jobs and stuff, what do those cost? We use that to price things. We use it to remove money from the economy or push money out into the economy. All this talk with the tax reform bill and all this talk in 2008 about stimulus, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about taking money out of the economy or pushing money back out into it. Now, none of us have seen recently any really taking money out of the economy to stop asset bubbles. We've kind of decided we like them, so we just sort of move from bubble to bubble. But there was a time when bankers believed, well, if things got too heated up, we take the punch bowl away. We take the punch bowl away by raising interest rates, but we also take it away by raising taxes. The other thing you want is you want an appearance of fairness. And it's not just an appearance of, you know, there's all kind of comments about the Tax Reform Act, oh heavens to Betsy, this is unfair to this or that other group. You want an appearance of fairness not just of the tax system, but of the entire economic system. The tax system, and this is the fun thing for us who are in the business of commenting about it, the tax system is like a proxy for the whole economic system. Especially since welfare was repealed in the Clinton administration, we basically used the tax system as a subsidy delivery mechanism and as a mechanism of sort of rewards and punishments. And that's the way we communicate with people, because we really don't need, we'll get to it in a second, we really don't need tax returns at all. Other countries don't have them. Your normal wage earner in a lot of European countries, they get a bill. They get a little statement from the government that said, well, you earned this. This is what we withheld. This is your refund or not. Please sign the bottom of this form. We could do that. We could do that for 100 million people. But we don't. And the reason we don't is cultural. All right, let's talk a little about why do we have the reserve currency and what's backing it if there's no gold backing it, okay? And we'll get back to our crazy military spending. Tell me what this little waterway is right here. No, this is the Persian Gulf right around here. I want that little place right there. The Strait of Hormuz. What happens in the Strait of Hormuz? What? I kind of hope there wouldn't be pirates there, you know. No, that thing's very heavily protected by the Fifth Fleet. What happens there? 50% of the world's oil goes through there every day because the most oil in the world it's in Siberia where it's hard to get, it's here where it's easy to get, it's here where it's easy to get, and it's here where it's easy to get. And there are American military bases basically ringing this area here. There's the Fifth Fleet here, Sixth Fleet here, Seventh Fleet here. Oil is priced in dollars, pretty much all over the world, except the other day the Russians and the Chinese decided to transact among themselves for all this Russian oil appear in Chinese currency. Oil is priced in dollars because American military power protects all these various kings and whatnot around here. And that means that if you want to buy oil, and you're not lucky enough to be buying it from the Russians and you made a special deal with them, you have to get dollars. So Europeans here, you know, they've got a new gold standard. They've hamstrung themselves with the euro. They have to get dollars to buy oil. So we have unlimited swap lines with our banks so they can get dollars to buy oil. But as long as everyone has to buy oil, everyone who needs oil, who isn't big enough to cut a special deal with some folks who have it or are willing to sell it in another currency, has to get dollars to buy it, dollar's a very valuable currency, isn't it? If you're off there in South America or Africa or someplace, you need it. I mean, Africans have oil. They have lots of oil in Nigeria. But if you need the stuff and you don't have it, you have to have dollars. That's why the dollar is nicknamed the petrodollar. That's why we're sitting here in this nice air-conditioned room with all this nice electricity. And it's so cheap, you don't even think about it. And you drove here in a car, and it didn't cost you that much to put gasoline in that car, did it? You don't think about your electric bill much, except you yell at your kids for leaving the air conditioning on all summer, right? When you're not yelling at them about those charge bills you didn't know about, right? But you didn't think about that. It was not a lot of money to fill the tank in your car. It costs a lot of money to fill a tank in Europe. And if we were having this lecture in Europe, room would be about half or a third the size, same number of people, you'd be sitting on top of each other, sweating, because there'd be no air conditioning. That is seigniorage. That is the exorbitant privilege of having the reserve currency, but it also means you don't have to tax yourself. Because other people, half the world's dollars are outside of the country, in the hands of people who need them to buy oil, or in the hands of people who earned them because, you know, they made products and they sold them to us and they've got this pile of dollars, and we don't let people use dollars to buy very much except Treasury securities. That's how we fund this deficit we're all supposed to be so excited about. And oil and silly old buildings that we want to get rid of because they're not valuable as office space anymore. But, you know, we're not going to sell anybody an oil company or anything like that. You know, there's all kind of restrictions on what you can buy with dollars, which means that it creates demand for treasuries. It's a nice, safe asset you can buy with dollars. All right, so let's go. Since we're supposed to be talking about the tax system, let's talk about, well, what are we doing with the tax system? It's like you're telling us we don't need to tax ourselves, but we are, right? And we know that of the taxes that are being paid, individuals are paying most of them, mostly through wage withholding. About 90% of the taxes we collect are through wage withholding. The other 10% we argue about with basically businesses and rich people. And we're making folks file returns. I mean, what is this page? There are actually not very many people who file this page. This is Schedule A. And what is this? This is really, actually, you know, it's kind of fun. This is an old one, right, from 2016. So those, you know, income taxes you paid, right, that line is gone. This is a load of subsidies, except for, you know, some stuff is genuine income measurement, like casualty losses. But mostly this is a load of things that we, you know, subsidize through the tax code. And because we use the tax code as a system of rewards and punishments, and we use the tax code to encourage certain behaviors. We think it's good that people get married and have children and get mortgages. Because once you've done all that, your life is so expensive you cannot quit your job. You cannot cause any trouble for anybody when you're looking at that mortgage, right? So we have all these nudges in the tax code for that, you know. There's the mortgage interest deduction, and it's actually very interesting what the new cap is going to do to that, because it's really not going to affect folks here, but it will affect prices on the East and West Coasts, because there's now a $500,000 cap on it. And on the East and West Coast, that doesn't buy you that much house, but what it's going to do is it's going to kind of squeeze that kind of high middle chunk of the market, and it's going to push prices down, which is going to make houses more available to the people, because the people who are buying the houses in this kind of $500,000 to $1 million range on those coasts, they're not rich people. They're just kind of reasonably well-paid people who are spending way too much for the house they're getting because the market demand and the fact that you really can't build anything in these places. If you guys wanted to build a house, that's another thing you don't have in Europe. You know, you don't regard that as a luxury. But if you wanted, let's say you had some fantasy house you wanted to build and it took up a lot of square footage, you could drive out further from here, right? Find some land and build on it, right? Can't do that in Germany. Look, see where we're going to go to get Germany back here. Okay, look at Germany there. It's pink. See it? There's 80 million people living in that little spot. Nobody's driving out and building a house. Okay, so getting back to this, and this all made a very interesting equation for the tax reform law. Because what the tax reform law was, is it was a monster corporate tax cut. It was a rate cut for companies, okay? Well, the thing about the way corporate taxes work is, just like this individual tax has a big subsidy component, the corporate income tax is a huge subsidy component. The corporate income tax is basically a subsidy with a tax attached. It's got like a 3-to-1 subsidy, tax to subsidy ratio, which means that if you wanted to lower the rate and there are deficit harpies hanging around and there is these crazy congressional budget rules which say, well, if you're going to give tax cuts, you have to claw it back over here with spending cuts or tax cuts or something like that, tax increases. Sometimes you have to balance it with exact tax increases, and other times you can combine tax increases and spending cuts, but you still have to, under their rules, account for everything you did. Now, we've told you, right, that the numbers are all hokey, right, that they're meaningless because of the amount of money. You know, if you really measured the federal budget and you said, what's really going out the door in the military? Maybe 40%. Crazy, huge numbers, not a quarter. That's the official number. It's a huge number, right? So the numbers are all fake anyway, okay? But the rules that the Congress made for itself, their budget rules, say that every time you give well, it's meaningful to the taxpayers, but it's meaningless to the government. I mean, here's how meaningless this is to the government. If you went down to the IRS, which I understand has hardly any employees to greet you at the door around here, if you went down to the IRS and paid your taxes in cash, okay, what would they do with the cash? Would they stick it in a lockbox and wait for the little Brinks truck to come and pick it up and haul it off to the bank? They shred it. They don't need it. Government creates money. Government, there's not a limited supply of dollars in the world. Dollars are not gold. The government creates money, pushes it out into the economy by spending, removes it by taxing. They take your cash and they put it in the shredder. Okay, so getting back to our corporate tax cut. Congress has rules that says whenever you give a tax cut, you have to account for it some way, depending on what kind of bill you're doing. And so what they had to do to give this corporate tax cut costs $5 trillion over 10 years, but that's only $500 million a year. That's not money. That's not a lot of money. The economy is $21 trillion. All of federal spending is about $4 trillion a year. Couple $100 million a year, $1 billion a year shoved out into the economy is really not much. But the congressional budget rules say you have to claw a certain amount of it back. So they go all the way through the corporate taxes and they find all these clawbacks that people like me spend our time thinking about. But you can't just get up and say, well, we're doing a tax bill and you 100 senators and you 435 congresspersons, you're going to vote for it, right? For a big tax rate cut for Walmart and Google. This does not go over well in the constituencies, right? So we have to have an individual tax cut, right? We gotta have a carrying case for this thing, right? But what if individuals aren't paying a lot of taxes? What do you do then? This is very dicey stuff, because if we look at the individuals, remember in 2012, people got all upset when Mitt Romney said 46% of people aren't paying income taxes. Okay, was that true? It was true. It was absolutely true. And it was true because of the Bush tax cuts of 2001. And now the number is like 40%, but it's still a substantial chunk of people. And here's what it is, okay? It's pretty much the folks who make paychecks of about $50,000 or less. A lot of them get all of their income taxes back as refunds, or they may get the earned income tax credit, in which they get, even more back. They get a subsidy, because we repealed welfare in the Clinton administration, and we replaced it with the earned income tax credit. But that means you have to go file. You don't have to file that piece of paper. You have to file, actually, a fairly complicated piece of paper. You have to communicate with the government by filing that return. And this is the behavioral aspect of the whole thing. We want to subsidize you for having this mortgage and whatnot, but you have to communicate with us by filing this return. Like I said, in other systems, in Europe, they don't have a high rate of home ownership either. Houses are, as you might imagine, with 80 million people in a place the size of Iowa and Germany, houses are very, 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 very expensive, and you in a lot of those countries, you wait to inherit your parents' house. They don't have to file returns. We make people communicate with the government with the return. We make poor people who need that money from the poor working people who need that money from the earned income tax credit communicate with the government by filing a return. All of this is kind of unnecessary, but this is like a cultural thing that we do. So if we get to, let's start on, well, who's paying the taxes here? We took out 40% of the people. They're getting all their wage withholding back, and maybe more sometimes, right? Then we look at there's a next set of people, and they make between like 50 and 100,000. Those are truly middle-class people. They're not paying a lot of taxes. And I used to think I used to, the line I would use is, well, they pay a lot collectively, but they don't pay a lot individually. Nope. They don't pay a lot collectively or individually. But there's a lot of them. And those are the ones whose taxes you need to cut. And you look at it, and this is where Nancy Pelosi got her crumbs remark. It's not much you can cut. Unless you want to just say, okay, you're not paying taxes either. But they had to work out a way to cut it, and they worked out a way to cut it, and so now those folks are paying less. The folks who are, then there's another group of people way at the top, and there's academic arguments about, is this the 1% or is this the 0.1%? It's really, really the 0.1%, because the 1% are largely composed of all those overpaid executives you hear about. You think, oh, it's hedge fund managers and sports stars and entertainers. Turns out there are not that many of those people, okay? And they don't earn it for that long. If you're a sports star and entertainer, your career is 3 years tops, right? There's a lot of overpaid executives, okay? Those are the 1%. They have high salaries, and they are taxed on salary at ordinary rates, so they are paying taxes. The 0.1%, these are the rich. They live off wealth. They get their money in special ways like interest and dividends and capital gains. They have a lot of control over the form and timing of their income depending on what they have their money invested in. But because they have so much money, they pay a lot of taxes. They don't pay at a very high rate, but they pay a lot of taxes in volume. And then you have the last group that we haven't talked about. You have the people who are the high salaried, okay? And these are the people who are feeling very hard done by because they got their state and local tax deduction taken away. And you say, well, how does that match up? Well, the way it matches up is the high salaried folks are on the coast. And they're in Chicago. They're in the high tax states and they're on the coast. And they are paying a huge chunk of the taxes. And they did not get much of a tax cut in this tax reform bill. And that the main reason for that is the people who were designing the bill had to make the numbers. But then when, folks in the news organizations come along, and these people are the same people, because the folks in the news organizations all live on the coast and they're very well paid. They jump up and down and say, well, you were just being vindictive to the blue states. And the answer comes back, no, but if we thought about it, we would be. Actually, there is no such thing really as a blue state. There are really red states and blue cities. And the question in every such situation is, do the cities outweigh the state in vote? Okay, what else do we have to talk about here? Do we have to talk about any more military spending? I might be running out of road here. I might. Okay. Oh, what did I talk about here? Okay, we talked about that. We talked about the. Okay. Oh, this is interesting because these were my predictions for it, and of course they all came true. And that was the other thing. We have like a whole obsession with the rates. I mean, most of you, after you filed your tax return, you couldn't tell me what your effective rate was, but companies can. Companies always know what the top rate is because they have to price things off of it for financial accounting. And as I explain to my readers all the time, and they look at me funny and don't believe me, companies don't care about their cash taxes. Companies care what they have to book. What do I have to show as a deferred tax liability? What do I have to book? Because they're all on accrual accounting, not what did I pay this quarter in cash taxes. The cash tax number is irrelevant. That's old taxes I owed New York State from 20 years ago when we finally settled the case. What do I have to book right now, and how's it going to hit my earnings? That's what they care about. What else is here? Anything? Yes, we talked about the high salaried. We talked about, well, we didn't talk about the territorial, but here's the interesting thing about the territorial. The territorial isn't totally territorial. And what the territorial was about was, if you were a big company and you had operations all over the world and you earned income all over the world, and you were an American company, you know, headquartered here and all, you owed taxes on all that income from all over the world to the United States government. And that, when you think about it, when we go back to our geopolitics here, right, that's kind of fair. I mean, look at all these oceans, right? Well, we could get this thing in the oceans. Look at this place right around here. This is where a Navy ship hit some sort of commercial ship the other day because the Navy is protecting the shipping lanes. But while the Navy is protecting the shipping lanes, they're kind of floating around in a kind of stealthy way, and there's an enormous number of commercial ships there of all nationalities. Gee, you know, if you're a big company and you're using those shipping lanes, shouldn't you be paying for that privilege? I mean, I kind of think foreign companies should be maybe paying a little more, right? It's not their Navy out there, you know. But there was all these arguments about it because American companies wanted, and this is how we got this corporate tax cut. Big American companies argued for years and years and years, we have to have a system like the Europeans have. Well, let's look at Europe. You know what they say about Germany? They say it's too big for Europe and too small for the world. Germany is an export economy. It has a lot of very big companies, but those big companies don't stay in business unless they can sell German products every place in the world. American company, you can be an American company and you can sell only to Americans. Walmart is a company like that, by and large. America is such an enormous market that you could just make stuff or sell stuff in the American market, not anywhere else, and you could be huge. But the only way European companies grow, and there are very big French companies, very big British companies, very big German companies, is to go outside. So they said in their tax systems, you don't have to pay taxes to your home government on the money you make outside. That was rational. And we always said to our companies, you have to pay taxes to us no matter where you go, and no matter where you earn the income. And the companies didn't like that at all. So they got that sort of reversed. There's a whole lot of clawback in these bills. So they're not really territorial. But part of the justification for this, and this is where things get a little overstated, because even though business people are pretty happy with the tax reform bill, even though it doesn't push that much money out into the economy net, it's only $150 billion a year, which is peanuts in a $21 trillion economy. It's kind of Keynesian animal spirits. It kind of puts them in a good mood. It's like, yes, you cut your taxes and we're going to repeal those pollution regulations, and you should be in a good mood and spend and create jobs. Except the create jobs part of the equation is a little tougher because people don't go and manufacture here because of taxes. This country is not a low-tax country. It's a low-wage country. You can take your old polluting equipment, literally take it, that you can't use here. You can put it on a boat, and you can use it there. You don't have to pay medical costs of your employees. You don't have to pay pension costs of your employees. Needless to say, your employees don't have unions. And all that stuff you make there comes into the United States without a bunch of tariffs on it because of China being allowed into the WTO. That's what did it. That's what clobbered American manufacturing. So then you say, well, we said you don't have to pay taxes on your foreign income, and we lowered the U.S. tax rate. Doesn't that tell companies to come back to the United States? And the two answers to that are we'll see and probably not. Because the countervailing pressures, as long as shipping stays cheap, I mean, you're still sticking stuff on a boat and bringing it across the Pacific Ocean, and that does cost something. But as long as fuel is cheap and shipping is cheap, and shipping is very competitive now. Shipping is cheap. The countervailing pressures to do your manufacturing in China are so overwhelming that the tax cuts alone are not gonna convince you to take your manufacturing back to America. And then the other unfortunate punchline to that is also there aren't that many manufacturing jobs. If you've been in a factory lately, what is a factory? A factory is an acre of robots with about a dozen people babysitting them. Apple's employees in the United States. Apple has 50,000 employees in the United States, 50,000 in the rest of the world. When a lot of the people in this room were small children, Ford had 50,000 people at River Rouge. One plant. They probably had 200,000 in their whole workforce. GM had 200,000 until recently. They're still around 100,000. But there is not. This is the other problem. Even if you get all the tax and tariff and whatnot incentives right, manufacturing, and the Chinese are automating themselves. Manufacturing is so automated that you really can't use it as an outlet for, we can employ very, very large numbers of people at good wages. We can employ some nice numbers of people at good wages, but it's not the kind of, numbers that we're looking for. And on that depressing note, what else do we have here? I'm about tapped, so if folks have questions, we can do that, or comments, or want to throw things, or whatever. Yes? You have to get a microphone. Yeah. You going to take that one?
Yeah, just for a second. We're being webcast, and so for people who are watching, we need to have you wait for the mic.
Yeah,
So.
okay. Oh, okay, well, you have the microphone, so I can't stop you.
Okay. I just would like to hear your opinion about how the middle class claim to be affected by the alternative minimum tax and the failure of Congress to repeal or adjust the alternative minimum tax.
But you had the word claimed in there?
Well, yeah, I'm trying to be kind. But, I mean, realistically, this has been an issue for probably 15 years.
Yeah.
And under the current administration, one would think that the issue of the alternative minimum tax would have been addressed, and that there would be quite a few people that would benefit in the upper tiers of the middle class sector by a repeal or revision of the alternative minimum tax.
Okay, let's go back to who's paying the taxes and who's middle class.
Well, under your definition.
Well, under my definition, I'm not middle class. Okay, under Chuck Schumer's definition, I am.
But under the IRS code,
the IRS doesn't have a definition of middle class.
But they have a range of who pays the alternative minimum tax, and that range
yes, and the range is
deeply into the middle class.
Well, if you think people with $50,000 and $100,000 incomes are paying alternative minimum tax?
Sure, they are.
With that incomes that low.
With incomes within the range of the middle class and under $100,000, yes, there are people that are paying the alternative minimum tax, and the tax, as I understand it to be, wasn't designed. No,
it was not. It was for very well-off people who had too many preferences, which is those little spending items we saw on the schedule. Where did we do with the Schedule A? Yeah. Using too many of those and using too many business preferences, but what happened was, and this is actually, it's a function of two things. I mean, I'm not justifying it, I'm just explaining it. It just goes back to making the numbers with the budget rules, because in 1986, when they had to make the numbers, and actually it really was 2001 when they had to make the numbers, because there's another set of numbers that these guys are highly sensitive to, and that's the distribution tables.
And a lot of, if we go, you know, you're saying there's folks in that true, what we can all call truly middle class group paying it. But there's a lot of folks in this high salaried group that are paying it. And, you know, we have arguments about whether they're middle class or not. They'll stomp and scream and say they are, they aren't. But in order to make the distribution tables kind of top weighted for tax paying, you had to leave it in place in the 2001 tax cuts, which were those Bush tax cuts, okay? So then fast forward to what we just did in the tax reform. And like I said, I'm not justifying it, I'm just explaining it. The way it was done in 2001 is there was stuff like deductions for your children defined as tax preferences, which shouldn't have been, okay? And that's what clawed people in, you know, who had 13 children or something, which is kind of ridiculous, especially when we've got all these other countervailing incentives where we're saying, no, we want you to have 13 children, okay? Then when you fast forward to what we just did, there was really a desperate effort to make the numbers and a desperate effort to make the distribution tables look good, because there would be screaming in the paper every day, oh, you're being unfair to the middle class. Okay, yeah, but the middle class aren't paying. Nobody ever said, you know, except people like me, nobody ever said, well, yeah, the middle class aren't paying a lot of taxes and it's hard to cut them. You know, everything had to be couched as a middle class tax cut. And then there was arguments about whether these high salaried should have their taxes cut, and they did not. The top rate stayed pretty high by U.S. standards, not by world standards. It's low. And they had to leave that thing in place. And that's sort of how it's kind of stuck in place since 1986. It's sort of like when all the dust clears and we're trying to make the numbers, it's like, oh, well, whatever, we have to leave it in place. You know, it's kind of a pickup, you know, but and it's very easy to fall into, but that's really all you can say about it. It isn't it started out as, like you're saying, a philosophical thing, but then, you know, because when it was designed as a philosophical thing, those budget rules didn't exist. The budget rules really came into existence in the early 80s. And it was folks like Bob Dole. There's all these very famous Midwesterners who have very great influence on, you know, oh, we can't spend more than we take in. No, come on, stop it. This is not a grocery store. But yeah, that's where it started to really stick in place and not be like an optional, you just took too many tax deductions, rich person tax. Okay. Sorry about that. That's all I can do, you know.
What is your opinion of the two hirees, Larry Kratno with the chief economic advisor for President Trump, who's been newly hired? They have Mac Mulvaney within the Office of Budget and Management. What influence?
Well, here's what's going to be fun about these guys, okay? Because we have the reserve currency, okay?
I'm talking about in the context of what you're talking about.
Oh, well, I'm getting to that, okay? Well, the point of the speech, the point of the reserve currency, the point of the pricing of dollars and oil is it doesn't matter what we do. It doesn't matter whose taxes we cut. It matters as far as popular support and popular opinion, whether the system is perceived as fair, but it really doesn't matter who pays what, okay? Kudlow is very anti-tax. He's very anti-corporate taxes. He wants even lower tax. That actually was an interesting thing. I'll get to that in a second. The capital gains tax. He's quite obsessed with that, okay? Mr. Mulvaney and that office that he works for, this is something my readers are very excited about, because when the president says he wants to get rid of regulations, okay, what does he mean? What he mostly means is pollution regulations. He mostly means the Clean Power Plan, which was an Obama administration set of regulations that basically say you can't burn coal in the Midwest. And those regulations are all tied up in court, and they're going to be tied up in court forever. And then the Trump administration is going to write some regulations reversing them, and that's going to be tied up in court forever. Okay? And when all the dust clears, we're going to keep burning coal. But what's interesting about Kudlow and his capital gains tax obsession is when the drafters of the new tax law were looking at the numbers, and we're talking about those distributional numbers, they were able to get more granular numbers about rich people. And the numbers about rich people are very interesting. The numbers about people who earn more than $1 million a year. There's, and I might not remember this correctly, but there's 4 sets of people. And you don't want to give rewards to all of them. And one of the things you notice, and this is very interesting because this is a Republican tax bill, mind you, right? Republicans for years and years and years and years and years, most of everyone's lifetime in this room, were obsessed with capital gains tax rates. And oh, heavens to Betsy, we must get them lower and lower and lower and lower and lower, right? Well, we have better numbers about people filing returns with $1 million incomes on them. And we can sort of segregate these populations. We have sort of your investor population, right? These people get capital gains, dividends, and interest. They're people who live off wealth, right? Okay. We have people with just very high compensation, like hedge fund managers and sports stars, right? We have business owners are another set, and I think there was a 4th set, but I forget which one. And so when they look at the numbers, they say, well, you know, for the coupon clipping crowd, I really don't have to give them a tax cut, because what are they going to do? Buy more securities? That's what they do. They're already rich. I don't need to give them an incentive to go off and buy more securities if they get richer, right? And then the sports stars and the hedge fund managers are not people that anybody's, you know, desirous of rewarding, right? They're not exactly a sympathetic population, and some of them earn this money for very short periods, right? So I don't have to worry about them. You know, people who want to be a basketball player, they're going to do that anyway, right? And if they succeed, that's nice, okay? And they're going to get taxed at very high rates because it's salary. The people I want to reward are business owners. And most of them, if you own a private business, they took my slides down. You own it as a partnership or as an S corporation, or maybe you just own it as a, you just own it as a nothing. But you don't own it as a corporation separate from you. You're paying salary rates on it. So what they did was they made a special lower rate for partnerships and S corporations, and it's called, it's got a long title, it's Section 199A, because they had these granular numbers and because they could tell who's earning what at the high end. And then we get back to Kudlow. Well, Kudlow is obsessed with capital gains. And if you ask Kudlow, he would say the capital gains rate has to be 0. Because people need to invest. Well, you know, there's this problem. Rich people are going to invest anyway. Rich people are rich because they can't spend all their money. That's kind of the definition. Somebody who's not spending all their money. They don't need any more incentive to invest, so the capital gains rate was not lowered. And if they say, and if Mr. Kudlow says, oh, heavens to Betsy, we're not going to stop till we get the capital gains rate to 0, the answer is going to, they're going to debate it and stuff, but the answer probably wind up being no, because it mucks up the numbers and because they don't really need it. So you have somebody who's he's kind of an exponent of a philosophy of taxation that has gone out of style. That's kind of long-winded. Whatever. I'm losing people here.
All right. I think that there undoubtedly are additional questions that people would like to ask, but in the interest of time, let me close the formal part of the program and thank Lee Shepard for her remarks. Before we wrap up, there's some swag that I'm supposed to present to you, so.
Swag.
Okay. And if you want to continue the conversation, we'll have a reception in the lower rotunda right behind us after this. So let's adjourn the